Venus looks like Earth's twin from space. Almost the same size. Almost the same mass. Almost the same place in the solar system. But when humanity finally reached its surface, it wasn't paradise. It was an oven hot enough to melt metal, pressure strong enough to crush steel, and air toxic enough to destroy anything that touched it. The Soviet Union sent machine after machine into this hell. Most never spoke again. A few survived just long enough to whisper terrifying truths. This is what they found on Venus, and why no one ever dared to return. For more interesting videos, please subscribe, like, and for most of human history, Venus was a mystery wrapped in beauty. Hanging brightly in our sky, it looked calm, peaceful, almost welcoming. Early astronomers could track its movement, calculate its orbit, and measure its size. But its surface remained completely hidden behind an endless blanket of clouds. Unlike Mars, whose surface could be vaguely studied through telescopes, Venus revealed nothing. That ignorance fueled imagination. Many believed that beneath the clouds could exist oceans, jungles, or even alien life. After all, Venus was nearly Earth's twin in size and composition, and it sat only slightly closer to the Sun, to early scientists. The closeness meant warmth, not catastrophe. By the mid-20th century, as the Cold War ignited the space race, Venus transformed from a scientific curiosity into a political prize. Reaching another planet was no longer just about knowledge. It was about dominance, prestige, and proving technological superiority. The Soviet Union understood this better than anyone. They had already stunned the world by launching Sputnik, sending the first human into space, and crashing probes into the moon. Venus was the next logical target. If the Soviets could be first to reach it, they would cement their image as leaders of humanity's expansion beyond Earth. But some scientists were uneasy. A growing theory suggested that Venus might not be paradise at all. Astronomers like Carl Sagan warned that the planet's thick clouds could be trapping heat through a runaway greenhouse effect, turning the surface into something closer to hell than heaven. Temperatures could be extreme. Pressure could be crushing. The atmosphere itself could be deadly. Still, theories were meaningless without data. The only way to know was to go there. So the Soviets did what they had become famous for. They took the risk. With limited computing power, slide rules, and raw determination, engineers designed the first interplanetary probes meant to reach Venus. These early machines were fragile by modern standards, guided by calculations that left almost no room for error. Once launched, there was no correcting course, no real-time control, no second chances. They were fired into the void and left to fate. What followed would become one of the most brutal learning experiences in the history of space. Exploration. Venus would not welcome visitors. It would destroy them, again and again. By the early 1960s, the race to Venus had truly begun. The Soviet Union moved fast, driven by momentum and confidence. Their first interplanetary attempts, Venera 1 and Venera 2, were bold but fragile machines. Built with technology that today would seem primitive, these probes were launched toward a planet no one had ever visited. Navigation was largely theoretical. Communication systems were unreliable. Once the rockets ignited, the engineers could do little more than wait and hope. Both probes came close to Venus, passing within tens of thousands of kilometers. But before they could transmit anything meaningful, they fell silent. Whatever secrets Venus held, it was clear she would not reveal them easily. While the Soviets regrouped, the United States saw an opportunity. In 1962, NASA's Mariner 2 probe succeeded where others had failed. It didn't land, but it didn't need to. Flying past Venus, it scanned the planet from orbit and sent back data that shocked scientists. The temperatures it detected were not warm, not tropical, but extreme hot enough to destroy life as we know it. This was no jungle world. This was a furnace. Mariner 2 also confirmed the presence of an enormous cloud layer stretching far higher than anything seen on Earth, trapping heat with terrifying efficiency. The runaway greenhouse effect was real. For NASA, the message was clear. Venus was hostile, unforgiving, and scientifically expensive. With limited budgets and political pressure mounting, American priorities shifted toward the Moon, and eventually Mars. Venus was quietly set aside. But for the Soviet Union, the data told a different story. To them, Venus wasn't a dead end. It was a challenge. And challenges were something they refused to walk away from. The Soviets believed they were standing on the edge of a historic breakthrough. Yes, the planet was extreme, but extremes could be engineered against. Stronger materials, thicker shells, smarter designs. If a probe could survive even briefly inside Venus's atmosphere, it could answer questions no human had ever answered before. What was the air really made of? How intense was the pressure? And could anything at all exist beneath those clouds? With renewed determination, the Soviets designed a new generation of probes. These spacecraft were heavier, tougher, and packed with scientific instruments. For the first time, they would attempt something audacious, sending a capsule directly into the Venusian atmosphere. Not to skim past it, not to observe from a distance, but to fall through it. When Venera 4 arrived in 1967, it carried a descent module designed to parachute slowly downward, sampling the air layer by layer. As it fell, the data it transmitted painted a disturbing picture. At higher altitudes, conditions were surprisingly mild, almost Earth-like. But as the probe descended, the temperature rose sharply. The pressure increased relentlessly. After more than an hour of descent, the signal vanished. The capsule had been crushed, squeezed out of existence by the sheer weight of Venus's atmosphere. This was a turning point. Venus was not just hot. It was violent. Its atmosphere behaved less like air and more like an ocean. Any future visitor would have to survive pressures capable of flattening steel and heat capable of melting electronics in minutes. Still, the Soviets pressed on. Because even in failure, Venus was finally starting to speak. By the end of the 1960s, the Soviet engineers knew they were no longer dealing with a normal planet. Venus was something else entirely. Its atmosphere was not a thin blanket of gas, but a crushing, suffocating mass that destroyed anything fragile. The logical response was obvious: build something stronger. The next generation of Venera probes were heavier, reinforced with thicker metal shells, and designed with one simple goal: survive longer than the last. Not for days, not even for hours. Just long enough to send back the truth. Venera 5 and Venera 6 were launched in early 1969, carrying nearly identical descent capsules. The hope was modest but critical. If the probes could last longer during their fall, scientists could finally measure how pressure and temperature changed closer to the surface. As the capsules entered the atmosphere, parachutes deployed and slowed their descent, allowing instruments to collect data. But Venus showed no mercy. Within less than an hour, both probes went silent. The pressure had climbed far beyond what the engineers had anticipated. The atmosphere compressed the capsules until they simply ceased to exist. No explosion. No warning. Just silence. Most programs would have ended there. The data was terrifying, the failures expensive, and the chances of success painfully small. But the Soviet space program was built on endurance. Instead of abandoning Venus, they made a radical decision. They would stop trying to float gently through the atmosphere. Instead, they would accept the violence of the planet and design their machines to endure it. For Venera 7, launched in 1970, the descent module was redesigned from the inside out. The outer shell was made thicker, stronger, and heavier. Inside, sensitive instruments were protected by a titanium pressure sphere, wrapped in insulation meant to delay the inevitable heat. Even the landing strategy changed. The engineers no longer trusted parachutes to survive. And when the parachute failed, either torn apart or melted during descent, the capsule fell freely toward the surface. It struck Venus at high speed, bouncing violently upon impact. Back on Earth, mission control assumed another total failure. The data stream was weak and broken, but then they realized something extraordinary. The probe was still alive. Despite the fall, despite the heat, despite the crushing pressure, Venera 7 was transmitting for 23 minutes. The capsule sent back the first confirmed measurements ever taken from the surface of another planet. The numbers were horrifying. Surface temperatures approached 475 degrees Celsius, hot enough to destroy most metals. The atmospheric pressure was more than 90 times that of Earth, equivalent to being nearly a kilometer underwater. Venus was not just uninhabitable, it was actively hostile to machines. And yet this was a victory. For the first time in history, humanity had landed on another planet and lived to tell the story, even if only briefly. Encouraged by this success, the Soviets pushed forward. Venera 8 followed in 1972, designed to operate longer and gather more data. This time, the probe survived nearly an hour. It confirmed the extreme conditions and revealed something unexpected. Even beneath the thick cloud cover, enough sunlight reached the surface to support visibility. That single detail changed everything. If light could reach the ground, then photographs were possible. And if photographs were possible, Venus could finally be seen, not imagined, not theorized, but witnessed. The race was no longer about survival alone. It was about vision. And the Soviets were closer than ever to seeing the face of hell. Once the Soviets knew that light could reach the surface of Venus, the mission objective changed completely. Survival was no longer enough. Now they wanted proof. They wanted images. Designing a camera for Venus, however, was unlike designing a camera for any other world. The heat could destroy electronics in minutes. The pressure could crush housings, and the corrosive atmosphere threatened to eat away at exposed components before a single photo could be taken. The solution was extreme engineering. Cameras were sealed behind protective covers, hidden inside pressure vessels, and programmed to activate automatically moments after landing. There would be no second chances. If anything failed, the image would be lost forever. For Venera 9 and Venera 10, launched in the mid-1970s, the spacecraft were redesigned once again. They were massive, weighing several tons, and relied on the density of Venus's atmosphere rather than parachutes to slow their descent. A wide aerodynamic shield acted like a brake, allowing the lander to fall safely without fabric components that could burn or tear apart. At the bottom, a thick impact ring absorbed the shock of landing. The philosophy was simple: let Venus do the work of slowing you down. Then hit the ground hard and hope the machine survives. In 1975, Venera 9 touched down and did something no spacecraft had ever done before. It looked around. The camera activated, the lens cap released, and the first photograph from the surface of Venus was transmitted back to Earth. What it revealed was not dramatic in the way people had imagined. There were no jungles, no oceans, no alien creatures. Instead, the image showed a barren landscape of fractured rocks scattered across a flat, dusty surface. The sky was dim and yellowish, lit by sunlight filtered through kilometers of thick cloud. It was not beautiful, but it was real. Just days later, Venera 10 landed in a different location and returned another image. This time, the ground appeared smoother, likely the remains of ancient lava flows. Together, these photos told a powerful story. Venus was geologically active in its past, shaped by volcanism on a massive scale. It was a planet that had once been dynamic and alive, even if it had become utterly hostile by the time humans arrived. Not every mission succeeded. Venera 11 and 12 reached the surface, but failed to return usable images due to mechanical problems with their camera covers. Venus demanded perfection, and even small mistakes were punished. But the Soviets learned quickly. By 1981, they were ready for their most ambitious landing yet. Venera 13 delivered the first color images of the Venusian surface. For the first time, humanity could see the true tones of another planet under alien skies. The ground appeared orange and brown, the rocks worn and fractured. In the distance, subtle changes in elevation gave the scene depth, making it feel unmistakably real and deeply unsettling. Venera 13 didn't just take pictures. It drilled into the surface, analyzed the soil, and recorded the sounds of Venus itself. The audio was nothing more than wind and mechanical noise. But hearing it created a chilling connection to a world that seemed determined to reject us. Venera 14 followed with similar results, confirming that the surface was dominated by volcanic rock, much like Earth's ocean floors. And with that, the mission reached its peak. Venus had been seen, heard, and touched. There was nothing left to prove. The planet had revealed itself not as a sister world, but as a warning one shaped by the same forces as Earth, pushed to a catastrophic extreme. By the early 1980s, the mystery of Venus had finally been stripped of its illusions. Humanity now knew what waited beneath those endless clouds. There was no paradise, no hidden ocean, no forgotten life. Venus was a planet shaped by the same forces that formed Earth, but driven to a brutal extreme. Temperatures hot enough to melt metal, pressure strong enough to crush submarines, air filled with corrosive chemicals. It was not a place where machines could survive for long, and certainly not humans. And yet, the most unsettling realization was not how different Venus was from Earth, but how similar it once might have been. The Venera missions achieved something no other planetary program ever had. They didn't just orbit. They didn't just observe from a safe distance. They touched another world. They listened to its winds. They drilled into its surface. But every success came with a hard limit. The longest-lasting lander survived for barely 2 hours. Every minute on Venus demanded extreme engineering, immense cost, and absolute precision. Compared to Mars, where rovers could explore for years, Venus offered almost nothing in return for such an enormous investment. As the 1980s progressed, the Soviet Union itself began to fracture. Economic pressure, political change, and shifting priorities brought the Venera program to an end. When the USSR collapsed, so did its vision of relentless interplanetary exploration. Russia entered a period of survival rather than discovery. Meanwhile, NASA had already made its decision. Venus was scientifically fascinating, but strategically impractical. Convincing governments to fund missions that would die within hours was an impossible argument to win, and so humanity moved on. Mars became the new frontier. Icy moons promised hidden oceans. Distant planets hinted at life beyond our solar system. Venus, once the most tempting destination of all, was left behind. Its surface remains frozen in time, untouched since the final Venera landers fell silent. The last photographs ever taken there still stand as the only direct glimpse we have of that world, but Venus has not lost its relevance. In fact, its story may be more important now than ever. Venus is a reminder of what happens when a planet's climate spirals out of balance. It shows how a world nearly identical to Earth can transform into something utterly unrecognizable. Not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow, unstoppable change. The same physics that warm our planet once turned Venus into an inferno. Today, new missions plan to study Venus again, but from orbit, safer, smarter, more cautious. No lander has returned. Perhaps one day, technology will catch up to ambition. Perhaps new materials will survive the heat and pressure long enough to explore again. Until then, Venus remains a warning carved in stone and fire. A planet close enough to touch, yet forever beyond our reach. So close, yet so far.